The morning sun painted the Nebraska sky orange and pink as James Morrison stood on the wooden porch of his ranch house. He held a steaming cup of coffee in his rough hands and looked out at the endless grassland that stretched beyond his property. At 32 years old, James was the oldest of four brothers who owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. But despite all their success, something important was missing from their lives. James took a sip of his coffee and thought about the conversation he had with his brothers the night before. They had been sitting around the kitchen table after a long day of working with the cattle. The subject that came up was one they had been avoiding for months. All 4 brothers were getting older, but none of them had wives or families of their own. The nearest town was Millfield, which was 20 miles away. Even in Millfield, there were only about 200 people living there, most of the young. Women had already married local men or had moved away to bigger cities in the east. The few unmarried women in town were either too young or had no interest in ranch life. The brothers had built a good life on their land, but they were lonely. Thomas Morrison, who was 30 years old, came out of the house and joined his older brother on the porch. Thomas was the most practical of the 4 brothers. He handled the business side of the ranch and was good with numbers. He had brown hair and serious eyes that showed he was always thinking about something important. "Did you sleep well?" James asked his brother. "Not really," Thomas replied. "I kept thinking about what we talked about last night. Maybe we should really do something about finding wives." James nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. The ranch was doing well. They had over 500 head of cattle and enough money saved to support families. They had built a large house with 4 bedrooms, hoping that someday each brother would have his own family living there. But years had passed, and the extra rooms remained empty. The kitchen door opened again, and William Morrison stepped outside. At 28 years old, William was the most social of the brothers. He loved to talk and tell stories. He had a warm smile and blonde hair that was always a little messy. People in town liked William because he could make them laugh and feel comfortable. "Good morning, brothers," William said with a grin. "I hope you are ready for another day of hard work and no female company." Thomas shook his head. "That is exactly what we need to fix. We cannot keep living like this forever." The youngest brother, Samuel Morrison, came out of the house last. At 24 years old, Samuel was quiet and thoughtful. He had dark hair and gentle eyes. He was the best with horses and could calm even the wildest animals. Samuel was also good at fixing things around the ranch when they broke. "What are we talking about?" Samuel asked. "The same thing we always talk about these days," William replied. "How we are 4 successful ranchers with no wives and no children." James finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch railing. "I have been thinking about something. Remember when we went to town last month and saw that newspaper from back east?" The other brothers remembered. They had been in the general store when the owner showed them a newspaper from Boston. In the back pages, there were many advertisements, from men looking for mail-order brides. There were also advertisements from women looking for husbands in the West. "You mean the mail-order bride advertisements?" Thomas asked. "Yes," James said. "Maybe we should think about placing our own advertisements in some Eastern newspapers. There are many women back east who want to start new lives in the West. Some of them might be interested in ranch life." Samuel looked worried. "But we do not know anything about those women. How do we know if they would be good wives?" "How do we know if the women in town would be good wives?" William asked. "At least this way we might have more choices." Thomas was already thinking about the practical details. "We would need to be careful about what we write in the advertisements. We should be honest about our situation and what kind of life we can offer." "What would we say?" Samuel asked. James had already been thinking about this. "We could say that we are 4 brothers who own a successful cattle ranch. We could explain that we live in a good house and have stable income. We would want to find women who are serious about marriage and starting families. Should we place one advertisement for all 4 of us, or should each of us place his own?" William asked. Thomas considered this question. "I think each of us should place his own advertisement. That way we can each describe what we are looking for in a wife. We are different people, so we might want different kinds of women." "That makes sense," James agreed. "We could place advertisements in different newspapers in different cities. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, maybe Baltimore. That would give us a better chance of finding the right women. Samuel still looked uncertain. What if the women who respond are not what they seem to be? What if they are lying about themselves? What if we are not what they expect either? William pointed out. This kind of arrangement requires trust from both sides. We just have to be honest in our letters and hope they are honest too. The brothers spent the rest of the morning discussing their plan. They decided that each brother would write his own advertisement, but they would all describe the same ranch and general location. They would also mention that they were brothers, so the women would understand the family situation. That afternoon, they rode into Millfield to visit the general store. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, was a friendly man who ordered newspapers from many eastern cities for the few people in town who wanted to read news from back east. "We want to place advertisements in some eastern newspapers," James told Mr. Peterson. "Do you know how we can do that?" Mr. Peterson smiled. "Looking for mail-order brides, are you? You boys are not the first ranchers around here to try that. I can help you send letters to the newspaper offices. It will cost some money, but it is not too expensive." The brothers spent the next hour writing their advertisements. James wrote about wanting a woman who was strong and could handle ranch life. Thomas wrote about looking for someone who was practical and good at managing a household. William wrote about wanting a woman who was friendly and enjoyed talking with people. Samuel wrote about hoping to find someone who was kind and gentle. Each advertisement mentioned that the man was one of 4 brothers who owned a successful ranch near Millfield, Nebraska. They described their house and land, and they promised to provide good homes for the right women. They also said they were looking for serious women who really wanted to get married and start families. Mr. Peterson helped them address their letters to newspaper offices in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. "These newspapers are read by many people," he said. "You should get some responses within a few weeks." As the brothers rode back to their ranch that evening, they felt both excited and nervous about what they had done. They had taken the first step toward finding wives, but they had no idea what kind of women would respond to their advertisements. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Samuel asked as they approached their house. "I think we had to try something," James replied. "We cannot keep waiting for wives to appear in Millfield. There are not enough single women here. Now we just have to wait and see what happens," Thomas said. Little did the brothers know that their advertisements would soon change their lives in ways they never expected. In a few weeks, 4 letters would arrive that would bring new people to their ranch and create a situation none of them had imagined. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of the small apartment she shared with her 3 younger sisters in Boston. The winter wind rattled the glass, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 26 years old, Margaret had become the head of her family after their father died 6 months earlier. The responsibility felt heavy on her shoulders every single day. Their father, Patrick Sullivan, had owned a small but successful importing business. He had worked hard to give his 4 daughters a good life and education. Margaret could read and write well, and she had even attended a ladies' academy for 2 years. Her sisters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary, had all received good educations, too. Their father had wanted them to be able to take care of themselves in the world. But everything changed when Patrick Sullivan died suddenly of a heart attack. His business partner, Mr. Whitman, had seemed like a trustworthy friend. He had promised to take care of the business and make sure the Sullivan sisters would be provided for. Instead, Mr. Whitman had stolen all the money from the business and disappeared one night, leaving the sisters with nothing but debts. Margaret turned away from the window and looked at her sisters. Catherine, who was 24, sat at the small table mending a torn dress. Catherine had always been the best cook and housekeeper among the sisters. She had thick brown hair and a strong, practical nature. Before their father died, Catherine had been planning to marry a young clerk named Robert, but when the sisters lost their money, Robert's family had forbidden the marriage. Elizabeth, who was only 18, sat on the bed reading an old book. Elizabeth was the gentlest of the sisters, with soft blonde hair and blue eyes. She was skilled with a needle and could sew beautiful clothes and decorations. Elizabeth had always been their father's favorite because of her sweet nature. She had never expected to face the harsh realities of poverty. The youngest sister, Mary, was 16 years old. She had red hair like their father and a quick mind. Mary had been the best student among the sisters and had dreamed of becoming a teacher. But now, like her sisters, she faced an uncertain future. "Margaret, what are we going to do?" Catherine asked, looking up from her sewing. "The landlord came by again today asking for the rent money. I told him we would have it by the end of the week, but I do not know how we will get it." Margaret sighed. The sisters had been living on the small amount of money they got from selling their father's personal belongings. They had sold his watch, his books, and even their mother's jewelry. There was almost nothing left to sell, and they were behind on their rent. "I went to 3 more houses today looking for work," Margaret said. "One lady said she might need a governess for her children, but she wants someone who can live in her house. She would not let me bring all of you with me." This was the problem they faced everywhere. Margaret was educated enough to work as a governess or teacher, but most employers wanted single women with no family responsibilities. Catherine could work as a cook or housekeeper, but again, most positions were for women who could live in their employer's house. Elizabeth and Mary were considered too young for most jobs that paid enough money to support 4 people. "What about the factory work?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Margaret and Catherine looked at each other. They had heard about the textile factories that employed young women. The work was hard and dangerous, and the pay was very low. Even if all 4 sisters worked in the factories, they would barely earn enough money to pay for a small room and basic food. It would be a life of poverty and hardship with no hope for improvement. "There has to be another way," Margaret said. She had been thinking about their situation constantly, trying to find a solution that would keep the family together. Mary stood up from the bed and walked over to a pile of old newspapers in the corner of the room. Margaret worked part-time, cleaning the office of a wealthy businessman, and she often brought home newspapers that he had finished reading. The sisters used the newspapers to start fires in their small stove, but sometimes they read them first. "Margaret, look at this," Mary said, holding up a newspaper from last week. "Remember these advertisements we saw?" Mary opened the newspaper to the back pages, where there were many small advertisements. Some were from people selling things, but others were personal advertisements. Many were from men in the Western Territories looking for mail-order brides. Margaret had noticed these advertisements before, but she had not paid much attention to them. Marriage to a stranger seemed like a desperate choice, and the Sullivan sisters had not yet reached that level of desperation. But now, as Margaret looked at her sisters' worried faces, she wondered if they had reached that point. "Listen to this." "On," Mary said, and she began to read aloud. "Successful rancher, age 32, seeks honest woman for marriage. I own large cattle ranch near Millfield, Nebraska, with good house and stable income. Looking for strong woman who wants family life. I am one of 4 brothers who work together. Serious inquiries only." Catherine looked up from her sewing. "4 brothers?" Mary nodded and picked up another newspaper. "Here is another one. Rancher, age 30, seeks practical woman for marriage. Good business sense helpful. Large ranch near Millfield, Nebraska. I am one of 4 brothers. Looking for woman who wants to manage household and start family." Elizabeth joined them at the table. They both mentioned 4 brothers in the same town. Margaret took the newspapers and read the advertisements more carefully. In different newspapers, from different days, she found 2 more similar advertisements. All 4 men described themselves as brothers who owned a ranch near Millfield, Nebraska. All 4 were looking for wives. "Do you think these 4 brothers each place their own advertisements?" Margaret asked. "It looks that way," Catherine said. "They are all looking for different kinds of women, but they all mention the same ranch and the same family situation." Margaret felt her heart beating faster. An idea was forming in her mind, but it seemed almost too bold to consider. What if all 4 Sullivan sisters responded to these advertisements? What if they could all go west together and marry these 4 brothers? "What are you thinking, Margaret?" Elizabeth asked, seeing the expression on her older sister's face. Margaret looked at each of her sisters. "What if this is the answer to our problems? What if we could all respond to these men and all go to Nebraska together?" Catherine put down her sewing. You mean we would all pretend to be strangers and each correspond with a different brother? Why would we need to pretend to be strangers? Mary asked. Because, Margaret said, thinking quickly, if they knew we were all sisters, they might think it was strange or suspicious. They might worry that we were trying to trick them somehow, but if we each wrote to a different brother and we did not tell them we were related, we could all end up at the same place. Elizabeth looked worried. But that would be lying. It would be not telling the whole truth at first, Margaret said. Once we got there and they met us, we could explain the real situation. If they are good men, they would understand why we did it. Catherine was thinking about the practical aspects. We would need to be very careful about what we wrote in our letters. We would need to make sure our stories made sense and did not contradict each other. And we would need to travel separately so they would not realize we knew each other, Margaret added. Mary was getting excited about the idea. It could work. We could each create a different background story. Margaret, you could say you were a governess. Catherine, you could say you were a widow who knew how to cook and manage a house. What about Elizabeth and me? Mary asked. Elizabeth could say she was an orphan who worked as a seamstress, Margaret suggested. And Mary, you could say you were a preacher's daughter who wanted to start a new life. The sisters spent the rest of the evening discussing the plan. They would need to write careful letters that made each of them seem like suitable wives for ranchers. They would need to save money for train tickets to Nebraska. Most importantly, they would need to trust that these 4 brothers were honest, men who would treat them well. Are we really going to do this? Elizabeth asked as they prepared for bed. Margaret looked around their small, cold apartment and thought about the uncertain future they faced in Boston. Then she thought about the possibility of a new life in the West, where all 4 sisters could stay together and have families of their own. Yes, Margaret said, we are going to do this. We are going to write to these brothers and we are going to go to Nebraska. None of the sisters slept well that night. They were scared and excited and worried all at the same time. They were about to take the biggest risk of their lives, but they felt they had no other choice. Tomorrow they would begin writing the letters that would change everything. The train whistle blew loudly as Margaret Sullivan stood on the platform at Boston's Union Station. She held a small traveling bag in one hand and a letter from James Morrison in the other. Her heart was beating fast with nervousness and excitement. After 2 months of writing letters back and forth, she was finally going to meet the man who might become her husband. Margaret wore her best dress, which was a simple blue cotton dress that she had carefully mended and cleaned. She had pinned her dark hair up neatly and tried to look like a respectable woman who would make a good wife for a rancher. In her letters to James, she had told him that she was a governess whose employer's family had moved away, leaving her without work. She had said she wanted to start a new life in the West and was looking for a stable marriage with a good man. What James did not know was that Margaret's 3 sisters were also traveling to Nebraska to marry his brothers. The sisters had spent weeks planning their deception carefully. They would travel on different days and take different routes so that no one would realize they knew each other. Margaret looked around the busy train station and saw all kinds of people saying goodbye to their families. She wished she could say goodbye to her sisters, but they had decided it was too risky. If anyone saw them together, their plan might be discovered. Instead, the sisters had said their goodbyes the night before in their small apartment. Remember, Catherine had told her, if anything goes wrong, if these men are not what they seem to be, we must find a way to protect each other. And remember our signals, Elizabeth had added. If one of us is in trouble, we will find a way to let the others know. Margaret climbed onto the train and found her seat. She would travel for 3 days, changing trains twice before she reached Millfield, Nebraska. She had never traveled so far from home before, and she had never been on a train for more than a few hours. The journey felt like an adventure and a terrifying risk at the same time. As the train pulled away from Boston, Margaret thought about the letter she had exchanged with James Morrison. His handwriting was neat and careful, and his letters showed that he was educated and thoughtful. He had told her about the ranch, about his brothers, and about the life they had built in Nebraska. He had asked her questions about her education, her interests, and her ideas about marriage and family. Margaret had been careful to answer honestly about most things, but she had lied about being alone in the world. In her letters, she had said that both her parents were dead and that she had no brothers or sisters. It was the biggest lie she had ever told, and it made her feel guilty every time she thought about it. 2 days after Margaret left Boston, Catherine Sullivan stood at the same train station preparing for her own journey. Catherine would take a different route through New York and Chicago. She carried a small bag and a letter from Thomas Morrison, who believed he was corresponding with a young widow named Catherine Walsh. Catherine had told Thomas that her husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her alone with no children and no family. She had said she was skilled in cooking, sewing, and managing a household, and that she wanted to marry again and have children. Thomas had seemed pleased with her practical nature and had written that he needed a wife who could help manage the business side of ranch life. Catherine felt nervous about the lies she had told, but she reminded herself that she was doing this to keep her family together. If she and her sisters had stayed in Boston, they would have been forced to separate and take whatever work they could find. This way, they would all be together in Nebraska, and hopefully, they would all find happiness. With the Morrison brothers, the train journey was long and uncomfortable. Catherine had bought the cheapest ticket possible, which meant she had to sit on hard wooden benches with many other travelers. She ate bread and cheese that she had packed herself, and she tried to sleep sitting up. The train was crowded and noisy, and it smelled of coal smoke and too many people in a small space. During the long hours on the train, Catherine thought about her sisters and wondered how Margaret was doing on her journey. She also thought about the man she was going to meet. Thomas Morrison had written about the ranch business and about wanting a practical wife who could help him manage their money and household. Catherine hoped she would be able to live up to his expectations. 1 week after Catherine left Boston, Elizabeth Sullivan began her journey to Nebraska. Elizabeth was the most nervous of all the sisters because she was the youngest and had never been away from her family before. She carried a letter from William Morrison, who believed she was an orphan named Elizabeth Grant. Elizabeth had told William that she had grown up in an orphanage and had worked as a seamstress to support herself. She had said she was looking for a kind husband who would give her the family she had never had. William had written warm, friendly letters that made Elizabeth feel hopeful about their future together. Elizabeth's journey was the most difficult because she took the longest route, traveling through several small towns to avoid being seen with her sisters. She changed trains 4 times and had to wait for many hours in small, uncomfortable train stations. Sometimes she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. On one particularly difficult night, Elizabeth found herself stranded in a small town in Ohio when her train was delayed by a snowstorm. She had to spend the night in the train station waiting room with several other stranded travelers. She was cold, hungry, and frightened, and she almost decided to turn around and go back to Boston. But then Elizabeth remembered her sisters and the promise they had made to stay together. She thought about the small, cold apartment in Boston and the factories where young women worked in dangerous conditions for very little money. She decided to continue her journey to Nebraska. Finally, 2 weeks after Elizabeth left Boston, Mary Sullivan began the last journey. Mary was only 16, but she was brave and determined. She carried a letter from Samuel Morrison, who thought she was the daughter of a preacher who had died, leaving her to seek a new life in the West. Mary had told Samuel that she had been educated by her father and could read and write well. She had said she wanted to marry a kind man and have children of her own. Samuel had written gentle, thoughtful letters that showed he was caring and considerate. Mary felt hopeful that Samuel would be a good husband for her. Mary's journey was the fastest because she took the most direct route. She was also the best at talking to people, so she made friends with other travelers who helped her during the difficult parts of the trip. An elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson shared her food with Mary and gave her advice about traveling alone. "You are very brave to go so far to meet a man you have never seen," Mrs. Peterson told Mary. "I hope he is worthy of your courage." Mary smiled but did not tell Mrs. Peterson the whole truth about her situation. She was not just traveling to meet one man. She was traveling to reunite with her sisters and hopefully find a new life for all of them. Each sister experienced different challenges during their journeys. Margaret's train broke down for several hours in Pennsylvania, and she worried that she would be late for her arrival in Millfield. Catherine got sick from the bad food available at train stations and felt weak and nauseated for 2 days. Elizabeth nearly lost her small bag with all her belongings when she had to change trains quickly in Chicago. But despite all the difficulties, all 4 sisters were determined to reach Nebraska. They had committed to this plan, and they would see it through no matter what happened. Each sister carried not only her own hopes for the future, but also the responsibility of helping her whole family find a better life. As the trains carried the Sullivan sisters across the country toward Nebraska, none of them knew exactly what they would find when they reached Millfield. They did not know if the Morrison brothers were truly good men, or if their plan would work, or if they would be able to keep their secret long enough to secure their futures. What they did know was that they were taking the biggest risk of their lives for a chance at happiness and security. They were traveling toward an uncertain future, but they were doing it together, even though they were apart. Soon, all 4 sisters would be in the same small town in Nebraska, and their plan would either succeed or fail completely. Margaret Sullivan stepped off the train at Millfield Station and looked around the small platform. The town was much smaller than she had expected. There was one main street with a few wooden buildings, a general store, a hotel, and a church. After the crowded, busy streets of Boston, Millfield felt quiet and peaceful, but also a little lonely. A tall man with brown hair and serious eyes approached her. He wore clean work clothes and a hat, and he walked with confidence. Margaret knew this must be James Morrison. "Miss Margaret O'Brien?" James asked, using the false last name Margaret had given in her letters. "Yes, that is me," Margaret replied, feeling nervous about continuing the lie. "You must be Mr. Morrison." James smiled and tipped his hat. "Welcome to Millfield. I hope your journey was not too difficult." "It was long, but I am glad to be here," Margaret said truthfully. James helped Margaret with her small bag and led her toward a wagon. "I thought we could go to the hotel first so you can rest and clean up after your trip. Tomorrow I will show you the ranch and introduce you to my brothers." Margaret felt relieved. She had been worried that James might want to get married immediately, before she had time to make sure he was a good man. The fact that he was being considerate about her comfort made her feel more hopeful about their future together. As they rode through the town in James's wagon, Margaret saw other travelers arriving and leaving. She wondered if any of them might be her sisters, but she tried not to look too interested. She had to act like someone who knew no one in this town. The next morning, James took Margaret to see the ranch. The house was bigger than she had expected, with 2 stories and several bedrooms. The land stretched out as far as she could see, with hundreds of cattle grazing in the distance. It was a successful operation, just as James had described in his letters. "This is a beautiful place," Margaret told James as they stood on the front porch of the house. "My brothers and I have worked hard to build it," James said with pride. "We hope to have families here someday, children who will grow up on this land." Just then another wagon approached the house. Margaret felt her heart stop when she saw who was in it. Thomas Morrison was driving the wagon, and sitting next to him was Catherine. Her sister Catherine, who was supposed to be traveling under the name Catherine Walsh and arriving the next day. Catherine saw Margaret at the same moment, and both sisters tried to hide their shock. They stared at each other for a few seconds before remembering that they were supposed to be strangers. "James, this is Miss Catherine Walsh," Thomas said as he helped Catherine down from the wagon. "She arrived on the afternoon train yesterday." James looked surprised. "Another mail order bride? Thomas, you did not tell me she was arriving so soon." "I wanted to surprise you," Thomas said with a grin. "Miss Walsh, this is my oldest brother James, and this is Miss Margaret O'Brien, who is here to meet James." Margaret and Catherine shook hands formally, but Margaret could see the worry in her sister's eyes. Something had gone wrong with their timing, and now they would have to be very careful not to reveal their relationship. "It is nice to meet you, Miss O'Brien," Catherine said politely. "What a coincidence that we both came to Nebraska to meet the Morrison brothers." "Yes, quite," A coincidence, Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. That afternoon, the situation became even more complicated. William Morrison arrived at the house with Elizabeth, who was traveling under the name Elizabeth Grant. Elizabeth had arrived in Millfield that morning, a day earlier than planned. When Elizabeth saw Margaret and Catherine standing on the porch, she nearly fainted. She had expected to arrive before her older sisters and have time to prepare for their eventual meetings. Instead, she found herself face to face with both of them, having to pretend they were complete strangers. "This is incredible," William said, laughing. 3 mail-order brides arriving within 2 days of each other. What are the chances of that? James was beginning to look suspicious. It does seem very unusual. Are you sure you 3 ladies do not know each other? The 3 sisters looked at each other nervously. Margaret spoke first. We have never met before today. It is certainly a strange coincidence that we all came to the same place at the same time. Perhaps we all read advertisements in the same newspapers, Catherine suggested. The Morrison brothers looked at each other. Thomas was frowning, and James looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Only William seemed to think the situation was amusing rather than suspicious. Well, regardless of how it happened, we now have 3 lovely ladies visiting our ranch, William said. We should make sure they are all comfortable. That evening, the 3 sisters sat together at the dinner table with the 3 Morrison brothers they had met so far. Samuel, the youngest brother, had not yet arrived with Mary. The sisters were trying to act like strangers, but it was very difficult. They knew each other's habits and expressions so well that they had to be constantly careful not to reveal their familiarity. During dinner, Catherine mentioned that she enjoyed reading books, which was something Margaret had also mentioned in her letters to James. Elizabeth talked about her sewing skills, which Catherine had also described to Thomas. The sisters were accidentally revealing information that made their stories overlap in suspicious ways. Miss Walsh, you mentioned that you enjoy reading, James said. What kind of books do you like? Catherine felt nervous. She had to be careful not to mention any books that Margaret might have also mentioned. I like practical books about cooking and household management. That is interesting, Thomas said. Miss O'Brien, what about you? Margaret had actually mentioned in her letters that she enjoyed novels and poetry, but she did not want to contradict Catherine. I also like practical books, she said. James looked even more suspicious. In her letters, Margaret had written about enjoying Shakespeare and other literature. Now she was claiming to prefer practical books, just like Catherine. The tension in the room was growing when they heard another wagon approaching the house. Samuel Morrison had arrived with Mary, who was traveling under the name Mary Sullivan. When Mary walked into the house and saw her 3 sisters sitting at the table, she could not hide her shock. Sisters! Mary exclaimed before she could stop herself. The room fell silent. All 4 Morrison brothers stared at the 4 women, and the sisters stared back with expressions of panic and guilt. Sisters? Samuel repeated slowly. You 4 are sisters? Margaret realized there was no point in continuing the lie. Yes, she said quietly. We are the Sullivan sisters. Margaret, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary. James stood up from the table, his face showing anger and confusion. So you have been lying to us from the beginning. You are not separate women who happened to find our advertisements. You are 4 sisters who planned this together. Please let us explain, Margaret said, also standing up. We can tell you why we did this. Why you lied to us, you mean? Thomas said coldly. Catherine felt tears starting in her eyes. We never meant to hurt anyone. We just wanted to stay together. William looked from one sister to another. I do not understand. Why did you not just tell us you were sisters from the beginning? Elizabeth spoke for the first time since Mary had revealed their secret. Because we were afraid you would not want all 4 of us. We thought if we pretended to be strangers, we could all come here and then later explain the truth. So you planned to deceive us permanently? Samuel asked. No, Mary said quickly. We planned to tell you the truth once we got here and made sure you were good men who would treat us well. James was pacing around the room now. How do we know anything you told us in your letters was true? If you lied about being sisters, what else did you lie about? Margaret felt desperate. Everything was falling apart and she did not know how to fix it. Most of what we told you was true. We really did lose our parents. We really were facing poverty and had nowhere else to go. We really do want to get married and have families. But you are not a governess, James said to Margaret. And Catherine, you are not a widow. And Elizabeth, you did not grow up in an orphanage. The sisters looked at each other, unsure how much more truth they should reveal. They had been caught in their lies, but they still needed to protect themselves. They did not know if the Morrison brothers would throw them out or treat them badly now that they knew about the deception. You are right, Margaret said finally. We lied about some of our backgrounds, but we told the truth about wanting good marriages and stable lives. The room was quiet for a long moment. The Morrison brothers looked angry and confused, and the Sullivan sisters looked frightened and ashamed. Everything they had planned and hoped for seemed to be crumbling around them. Finally, James spoke. I think we all need time to think about this situation. Ladies, you are welcome to stay in our guest rooms tonight. Tomorrow we will decide what to do next. That night, the Sullivan sisters gathered in one of the guest rooms and talked in whispers about what had happened. What are we going to do now? Elizabeth asked. They will probably send us back to Boston. We do not have money for train tickets back, Catherine pointed out. Maybe we can find work in town, Mary suggested. Margaret looked at her younger sisters and felt responsible for the disaster their plan had become. The next morning, the Sullivan sisters woke up early and helped prepare breakfast for everyone. They wanted to show the Morrison brothers that they were useful and hard-working, even though they had been caught lying. Margaret cooked eggs and bacon while Catherine made fresh bread. Elizabeth set the table with the good dishes, and Mary made coffee that smelled wonderful throughout the house. When the four brothers came down for breakfast, they found a meal better than any they had made for themselves in years. The sisters had worked together like they had done it 1,000 times before, which of course they had. They moved around the kitchen easily, knowing exactly what each other needed without speaking. James sat down at the head of the table and looked at the food. This is very good, he said quietly. Thank you. We wanted to show you that we can be helpful, Margaret said. Even if we started with lies, we meant what we said about wanting to be good wives. Thomas picked up a piece of Catherine's bread and tasted it. This bread is excellent, much better than what we usually eat. Catherine felt a little bit of hope. I have been cooking since I was 12 years old. I can make many different kinds of meals. Samuel looked at Mary, who was pouring coffee for everyone. You are very young. Are you really old enough to get married? Mary straightened her shoulders and tried to look older. I am 16. Many girls my age are already married and have children. But you are far from home and family, Samuel said gently. That is different from marrying someone in your own town. We have no family left except each other, Elizabeth said, and we have no home to go back to. William had been quiet during breakfast, but now he spoke up. I think we need to understand exactly what happened to you ladies. Why did you really come to Nebraska? Margaret looked at her sisters and decided it was time to tell the complete truth. She told the Morrison brothers about their father's death, about Mr. Whitman stealing their inheritance, and about facing poverty and possible separation in Boston. She explained how they had found the brothers' advertisements and made the plan to come to Nebraska together. We knew it was risky, Margaret said, but we thought if we could all get to the same place, we could protect each other and still have the chance for good marriages. So you chose us because there were 4 of us, James said. Not because you were actually interested in marrying us as individuals. Catherine shook her head. That is not true. We read all of your letters carefully. We each chose the brother whose advertisement seemed most compatible with our personalities. How do we know that? Thomas asked. How do we know you did not just divide us up randomly? Elizabeth looked directly at William. You wrote about wanting someone who enjoyed talking and laughing. I chose to write to you because you seemed kind and friendly. I was not just picking a name from a list. Mary nodded. And Samuel, you wrote about wanting someone gentle and caring. I felt like I could be that person for you. Samuel studied Mary's face. But you were also the youngest sister, so you got the youngest brother. That seems convenient. Maybe it was meant to be, Mary said boldly. Maybe we found each other for good reasons, even if we started with deception. The brothers looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that close family members can have without words. Finally, James spoke for all of them. Here is what we have decided, he said. You ladies have traveled a long way, and you have nowhere else to go. We do not want to send you back to poverty and danger. But we also cannot marry you right away after learning that you lied to us. Margaret felt relieved that they were not being sent away immediately, but also worried about what the brothers had in mind. We propose a trial period, Thomas continued. You can stay here on the ranch for the next 3 months. During that time, we will all get to know each other honestly. No more lies, no more pretending. At the end of 3 months, we will each decide if we want to proceed with marriage. What if some of us decide yes and others decide no? Catherine asked. We will face that problem when it comes, William said. For now, we are offering you a chance to prove that you can be honest and that we can be compatible. Elizabeth looked hopeful. You mean we can stay together for 3 months? Yes, Samuel said, but there will be rules. You will each have your own bedroom. There will be no inappropriate behavior between any of us. You will help with the work around the ranch, and we will all contribute to running the household. Margaret nodded. That seems fair. We accept your offer. The next few weeks were strange and difficult for everyone. The Sullivan sisters had to learn to live with 4 men they barely knew, while pretending that they did not know each other, as well as they actually did. The Morrison brothers had to adjust to having 4 women in their house, and they had to decide if they could trust people who had already lied to them. At first, everyone was very polite and careful around each other. The sisters worked hard to keep the house clean and cook good meals. The brothers showed them around the ranch and explained how the cattle business worked. But underneath the politeness, there were tensions and complications. Margaret found herself spending most of her time with James, since they had originally planned to marry each other. James was serious and responsible, and Margaret respected his intelligence and leadership. But she also noticed that James seemed more interested in Catherine than in her. When Catherine talked about managing the ranch's finances, James listened carefully and asked detailed questions. When Margaret tried to discuss the same topics, James seemed less engaged. Catherine was supposed to be getting to know Thomas, but she found herself drawn to James instead. James had a quiet strength that reminded her of her father, and she admired how he took care of his younger brothers. Thomas was practical and efficient, which Catherine appreciated, but there was no romantic spark between them. Elizabeth was spending time with William, and they seemed to get along well. William made Elizabeth laugh, and he was gentle with her when she felt nervous or homesick. But Elizabeth found herself watching James when she thought no one was looking. She was attracted to his maturity and the way he took responsibility for everyone around him. Mary was the only sister who seemed well matched with her intended brother. She and Samuel had long conversations about books, horses, and their dreams for the future. Samuel was kind and patient, and he treated Mary with respect despite her young age. Mary felt safe with Samuel in a way she had not felt since her father died. The situation became more complicated as the weeks passed. William noticed that Elizabeth often looked at James instead of paying attention to him. Thomas realized that Catherine seemed more interested in discussing ranch business with James than with him. James found himself thinking about Catherine's cooking and her practical suggestions more than Margaret's attempts at conversation. Only Samuel and Mary seemed to be developing genuine feelings for each other, but even they were affected by the tension in the house. Mary worried that if her sisters were not happy, the whole arrangement might fall apart. Samuel wondered if he should encourage his brothers to end the trial period before anyone got hurt. One evening in late October, the tensions finally came to a head. The family was sitting around the dinner table when William made a comment about Elizabeth seeming distracted lately. I am not distracted, Elizabeth said quickly. I am just trying to learn about ranch life. You seem to be learning more from James than from me, William said, not unkindly but with obvious frustration. Elizabeth blushed and looked down at her plate. Catherine came to her sister's defense without thinking. Elizabeth is just interested in understanding how the whole ranch works, Catherine said. She learns by watching everyone. And what about you, Catherine? Thomas asked. Are you also just learning by watching James all the time? Margaret realized that the careful politeness they had all been maintaining was about to collapse. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, she suggested. No, James said firmly. If we are going to be honest with each other, then we need to talk about what is really happening here. James looked around the table at everyone. I think it is clear that the original pairings are not working for all of us. Some of us seem more compatible with different people than we originally planned. William nodded. I have noticed that too, and I think we need to be honest about our feelings before someone gets hurt. Samuel looked at Mary with concern. What do you think, Mary? Do you want to change the arrangements? Mary felt torn between her own happiness with Samuel and her loyalty to her sisters. I think we all need to follow our hearts, she said carefully. But we also need to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. Margaret realized that she was the one who needed to be most honest. James, she said, I can see that you are more interested in Catherine than in me. And I think Catherine feels the same way about you. Catherine looked surprised that Margaret had spoken so directly, but she did not deny it. And Elizabeth, Margaret continued, I think you are also drawn to James rather than William. Elizabeth turned red, but nodded slowly. So what do we do about this? Thomas asked. 3 women interested in 1 man does not solve anyone's problems. The room fell quiet, as everyone considered the complicated situation they had created. The November wind was getting colder, and everyone at the ranch could feel that winter was coming soon. The Sullivan sisters had been living with the Morrison brothers for 6 weeks, and the trial period was halfway over. But instead of things getting clearer, the relationships between all of them were becoming more complicated every day. Mary Sullivan sat by the window in her bedroom, looking out at the gray sky and thinking about her sisters. She was the only one who seemed truly happy with her original match. Samuel Morrison was kind, gentle, and treated her with respect. They spent hours talking about books, and Samuel was teaching her about taking care of horses. Mary felt like she could build a good life with Samuel, but Mary was also keeping a terrible secret that was growing harder to hide every day. She was pregnant. Before the Sullivan sisters had left Boston, something awful had happened to Mary. One night, when she was walking home from her job cleaning offices, a man had attacked her in an alley. The man had hurt her badly and then run away, leaving Mary bleeding and terrified. Mary had been too ashamed to tell her sisters exactly what happened. She had only said that she had been attacked and robbed. But now, 2 months later, Mary realized she was going to have a baby. She had been feeling sick in the mornings and her body was changing in ways that frightened her. She had been trying to hide her condition from everyone, but she knew she would not be able to keep the secret much longer. Mary was terrified about what would happen when Samuel and his brothers learned the truth. Would Samuel still want to marry her if he knew she was carrying another man's child? Would the Morrison brothers throw her and her sisters off the ranch? Mary felt trapped and scared, but she did not know what to do. Downstairs, Catherine Sullivan was having her own difficult conversation with Thomas Morrison. They were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, and Thomas was looking at some papers related to the ranch's finances. Catherine, I need to tell you something, Thomas said seriously. I have been thinking about our situation and I realize that we should be completely honest with each other. Catherine felt nervous. What do you want to tell me? Thomas sat down his papers and looked directly at Catherine. I have been sending money to a woman named Anna in the next county. Anna and we were involved with each other about 3 years ago. She has a son and the boy might be mine. Catherine stared at Thomas in shock. This was not what she had expected him to say. I never married Anna because she was already married to another man, Thomas continued. Her husband was a drunk who treated her badly. Anna and I fell in love, but we knew it was wrong. When she became pregnant, her husband left town and never came back. Anna has been raising the boy alone. Why are you telling me this now? Catherine asked quietly. Because I have been sending money to help support the child, and I will continue to do that even if we get married. I thought you should know before you decide whether you want to build a life with me. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what Thomas had told her. She realized that everyone in this house was carrying secrets and complications. Thomas had a possible child with another woman. Mary was hiding something that made her look sick and worried all the time. Margaret was pretending to be interested in James when Catherine could see that Margaret's feelings were not genuine. Thomas, Catherine said finally, I appreciate you being honest with me, but I need to be honest with you too. I do not think we are right for each other. Thomas looked surprised. Because of Anna and the boy? No, Catherine said. Because my heart is drawn to James, not to you. I have been trying to force myself to have feelings for you, but it is not working. Thomas nodded slowly. I had suspected that. I can see the way you look at James, and the way he looks at you. Are you angry? Catherine asked. No, Thomas said. I am actually relieved. I have been feeling guilty about Anna and the boy, and I have also been feeling like we were trying to force something that was not natural. Meanwhile, in the barn, Elizabeth Sullivan was helping Samuel Morrison take care of the horses when she finally decided to share her own worries. Samuel, can I ask you something? Elizabeth said as she brushed one of the horses. Of course, Samuel replied. What is on your mind? Do you think it is wrong for someone to change their mind about who they want to marry? Samuel stopped what he was doing and looked at Elizabeth carefully. Are you thinking about changing your mind about William? Elizabeth nodded. William is a good man, and he has been kind to me. But I do not feel the kind of love for him that I think I should feel for a husband. What kind of love do you think you should feel? Samuel asked gently. Elizabeth hesitated, then decided to be brave. The kind of love I feel when I look at James. Samuel was quiet for a moment. He had noticed the way Elizabeth watched his oldest brother, and he had also seen how James seemed more comfortable talking with Catherine than with Margaret. Elizabeth, Samuel said carefully, I think James cares about Catherine, not you. Elizabeth felt tears starting in her eyes. I know that, I can see it, but I cannot help how I feel. Samuel put down the brush he was holding and moved closer to Elizabeth. What about your sister Mary? She and I have been getting along well, but if all of you are unhappy with your matches, maybe we should reconsider the whole arrangement. Elizabeth looked alarmed. No, please do not do that because of me. Mary is happy with you, and she needs this marriage to work out. Why does Mary need it more than you do? Samuel asked. Elizabeth realized she had said too much. She suspected that Mary was hiding something important, but she was not sure what it was. I just think Mary has fewer options than the rest of us. That evening, a winter storm hit the ranch with unexpected force. The wind howled around the house, and snow began falling heavily. By the next morning, the snow was so deep that no one could leave the ranch. They were all trapped together in the house until the storm passed. Being trapped together forced everyone to spend more time talking honestly with each other. On the second day of the storm, Margaret Sullivan finally had a serious conversation with James Morrison. James, I think we need to admit that this is not working between us, Margaret said as they sat by the fire in the main room. James looked relieved. I have been thinking the same thing. You are a wonderful woman, Margaret, but I do not think we are compatible for marriage. I agree, Margaret said. I think you and Catherine would be much better suited for each other. James was quiet for a moment. What about you? What will you do if Catherine and I decide to pursue a relationship? Margaret had been thinking about this question for days. I think I would like to stay in Millfield and become a teacher. I could start a school for the children in town. I would not need to marry to have a useful, independent life. James smiled. That sounds like something you would be good at. You are clearly educated and intelligent, and you and Catherine could help each other run this ranch, Margaret said. She understands business and she cares about making this place successful. On the third day of the storm, William Morrison approached Elizabeth with his own honest thoughts. Elizabeth, I can see that your heart is not with me, William said kindly. You do not need to pretend anymore. Elizabeth felt guilty. William, you have been so kind to me. I wish I could feel differently. You cannot force feelings, William said, and I would rather know the truth than live with someone who was just pretending to care about me. What will you do? Elizabeth asked. William smiled. I think I will be fine. I have been thinking that maybe I am not ready for marriage yet. I enjoy traveling and meeting new people. Maybe I should spend some time exploring other places before I settle down. But the biggest revelation came on the fourth day of the storm, when Mary Sullivan could no longer hide her secret. She had been feeling very sick, and when Catherine came to check on her, Mary finally broke down and told her sister the truth. Catherine, I am pregnant, Mary whispered, tears streaming down her face. Catherine sat down heavily on the bed. Pregnant? How is that possible? You have not been alone with Samuel. Mary told Catherine about the attack in Boston and about hiding her condition for the past 2 months. Catherine held her younger sister while Mary cried and expressed all her fears about what would happen when Samuel learned the truth. We have to tell them, Catherine said finally. We cannot keep hiding this. They will send us away, Mary said. Samuel will not want to marry me when he knows I am carrying another man's child. We do not know that, Catherine said, though she was worried about the same thing. Samuel seems like a good man. Maybe he will understand. That evening, with the storm still raging outside, the Sullivan sisters decided it was time to reveal all their secrets and let the Morrison brothers make their final decisions about the future. The trial period was nearly over anyway, and they could not continue hiding the truth. Margaret, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Mary gathered in the main room with James, Thomas, William, and Samuel. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and the wind howled outside, making the house feel like the only safe place in the world. We have some things we need to tell you, Margaret began. Important things that will affect all of our futures. The Morrison brothers settled in to listen, not knowing that they were about to learn secrets that would change. The wind continued to howl outside as the Sullivan sisters and Morrison brothers sat around the fireplace in the main room. The storm had been going on for 4 days, and everyone was feeling the tension of being trapped together with so many unspoken truths hanging in the air. Margaret looked at her sisters and knew it was time to be completely honest about everything. Before we tell you our secrets, Margaret began, we want you to know that we are grateful for the kindness you have shown us. Even though we started with lies, you have treated us with respect and given us a chance to prove ourselves. James nodded. We appreciate that, Margaret. Now tell us what we need to know. Margaret took a deep breath. First, I need to admit something about my own feelings. James, you have been a gentleman and a good man, but I do not think we are meant to be husband and wife. I think you and Catherine have feelings for each other that I cannot compete with, and I do not want to try. Catherine looked surprised that Margaret had spoken so directly, but she felt relieved that the truth was finally coming out. What will you do if you do not marry James? Thomas asked Margaret. I want to stay in Millfield and start a school, Margaret said. I have been thinking about this for weeks. This town needs a teacher and I need a purpose that does not depend on marriage. I want to be independent and help educate the children here. Samuel looked thoughtful. That sounds like a good plan. But how will you support yourself? I can charge families a small fee for schooling, Margaret replied. And maybe I can do some tutoring for adults who want to learn to read and write better. Elizabeth spoke next, her voice shaking with nervousness. I also need to confess something. William, you have been wonderful to me, but my heart is not with you. I have tried to force myself to have romantic feelings for you, but I cannot. William smiled gently. I know, Elizabeth. I could see that you were struggling. I am not angry with you. The truth is, Elizabeth continued, looking down at her hands, I have feelings for James, too. I know that Catherine also cares for him, and I know that he returns her feelings, not mine, but I cannot help how I feel. James looked uncomfortable. Elizabeth, I am flattered, but you are right that my feelings are for Catherine. Elizabeth nodded, tears in her eyes. I understand. I will have to learn to accept that. What will you do? Catherine asked her sister gently. Elizabeth wiped her eyes. I have been thinking about that too. I am good at sewing and making clothes. Maybe I could open a dress shop in town. Women here might want nicer clothes than what they can make themselves. Thomas looked interested. That could work. There are more families moving to this area all the time. Now it was time for the most difficult confession. Mary looked at Samuel and her face was pale with fear. Samuel, there is something I must tell you, even though it might change everything between us. Samuel could see how frightened Mary was, and he moved closer to her, on the couch. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Mary's voice was barely a whisper. I am pregnant. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of the wind outside. Samuel stared at Mary in shock, and his brothers looked just as surprised. Pregnant? Samuel repeated. But we have not. You and I have never. The baby is not yours, Mary said, tears streaming down her face. Before we left Boston, a man attacked me one night. He hurt me badly and then he ran away. I was too ashamed to tell anyone exactly what happened, even my sisters. I thought I could hide it, and that maybe it would go away somehow. But I cannot hide it anymore. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing what Mary had told him. The other brothers and sisters watched his face, trying to understand what he was thinking. How far along are you? Samuel asked gently. About 3 months, Mary replied. The baby will be born in the spring. Samuel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the swirling snow. Everyone waited to hear what he would say. Mary was crying quietly, and her sisters were holding her hands in support. Finally, Samuel turned back to the group. Mary, I am sorry that happened to you. No woman should have to go through such a terrible thing. I understand if you do not want to marry me now, Mary said. I know this changes everything. Samuel sat back down next to Mary and took her hands in his. It does change things, but not in the way you think. Everyone looked at Samuel in surprise. Mary, I have come to care about you very much over these past weeks, Samuel said. I admire your courage, your intelligence, and your kind heart. The fact that you survived something so terrible and still came all this way to build a new life shows how strong you are. Mary looked up at Samuel with hope in her eyes. What are you saying? I am saying that if you will have me, I still want to marry you, Samuel said firmly. The baby will be my child too because you will be my wife. We will raise this child together, and we will love him or her just as much as any children we might have together in the future. Mary began crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and happiness. You really mean that? I really mean that, Samuel said, and he leaned over to kiss Mary's forehead. Margaret, Catherine, and Elizabeth all felt tears in their own eyes as they watched their youngest sister receive the acceptance and love she had been so afraid to hope for. Samuel, you are a good man, Margaret said. Mary is lucky to have found you. Now Thomas spoke up. Since we are all being honest, I should tell you about my own situation. Catherine, I told you about Anna and the boy who might be my son. I will continue to support them financially, and I will visit them sometimes to make sure they are well cared for. Catherine nodded. I understand, Thomas. You are being responsible. The thing is, Thomas continued, I can see that your heart is with James, not with me, and I think James feels the same way about you. James looked at Catherine. Thomas is right. Catherine, I have grown to care about you very much. You understand this ranch and this life in a way that makes me think we could be real partners. Catherine felt her heart beating faster. I feel the same way about you, James. But what about the original arrangements? William asked. We all came here with specific plans. Sometimes plans need to change, James said. What matters is that we are honest about our feelings and that everyone is treated fairly. Elizabeth spoke up again. I want all of you to be happy, even if it means I do not get what I originally wanted. James and Catherine belong together. Mary and Samuel belong together. That leaves Thomas, William, and me to figure out our own paths. Thomas looked thoughtful. Elizabeth, would you consider staying in town and opening your dress shop? You could live independently, but you would still be close to your sisters. I would like that, Elizabeth said. And maybe someday I will meet someone who is right for me. William grinned. And I have been thinking that I might like to travel and see more of the country before I settle down. There are opportunities for business in other territories, and I could send money back to help support the ranch. So we would have James and Catherine here running the ranch, Samuel said. Mary and me raising our family here, Margaret teaching school in town, Elizabeth running a dress shop in town, and William traveling but staying connected to the family. That sounds like a good plan to me, James said, but we should all take time to think about it carefully. These are big decisions. The storm continued for 3 more days, giving everyone plenty of time to talk through all the details of their new arrangements. They discussed practical matters, like money, living situations, and how they would handle the changes in their relationships. They also talked about their feelings and their hopes for the future. By the time the storm ended and the sun came out again, everyone had made their final decisions. James and Catherine would marry as soon as possible and take over full responsibility for running the ranch. Samuel and Mary would marry immediately, and Samuel would help raise Mary's baby as his own child. Margaret would move to town and start planning her school. Elizabeth would also move to town and begin working on her dress shop business. William would stay long enough to help with the spring cattle work, and then he would begin his travels. As they prepared for the changes ahead, all 4 Sullivan sisters felt grateful that they had taken the risk of coming to Nebraska. Their deception had led to complications and difficult conversations, but it had also led them to people who cared about them and to opportunities they never could have had in Boston. The Morrison brothers felt grateful too. They had found not just wives, but a whole family that would help them build something bigger and better than they had ever imagined. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most satisfying destinations. Spring came early to Nebraska that year, and with it came new life in many forms. The snow melted away to reveal green grass and wildflowers, and the cattle grew fat on the fresh pasture. But the biggest changes were happening with the people, who now called Millfield Ranch their home. On a warm day in April, Mary Sullivan Morrison gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Samuel held his wife's hand as she brought their son into the world, and when the baby cried for the first time, Samuel cried too. He had never felt such overwhelming love for a child who was not even his by blood. What should we name him? Mary, asked Samuel as she held the tiny baby. What would you like to name him? Samuel replied. Mary thought for a moment. I would like to name him Patrick, after my father. Patrick Morrison. Samuel smiled. Patrick Morrison. I like that name very much. The baby had red hair like Mary and his grandfather, and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. From the moment Patrick was born, Samuel treated him exactly like his own son. He got up in the middle of the night to help with feedings. He rocked the baby to sleep, and he spent hours just talking to Patrick about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they would do together as Patrick grew up. Mary watched Samuel with their son and felt her heart fill with gratitude every day. She had been so afraid that no man would want to marry her after what had happened in Boston. But Samuel had not only accepted her and her baby, he had embraced them both with complete love. James and Catherine Morrison were married in a simple ceremony at the church in Millfield just 2 weeks after the baby was born. Catherine wore a dress that Elizabeth had made especially for the wedding, and Margaret decorated the church with wildflowers from the ranch. The whole town came to the wedding, and everyone agreed that the bride and groom looked perfectly happy together. James had never imagined that marriage could be such a partnership. Catherine understood every aspect of ranch life, from managing the finances to planning for the future growth of their cattle herd. She could cook for a large crew during busy seasons, and she could also sit with James in the evening and discuss business decisions as an equal partner. Catherine had found in James the kind of steady, reliable love she had always wanted. James was a man who kept his promises and worked hard to provide for his family. He treated Catherine with respect and listened to her opinions about important matters. Together, they were building something that would last for generations. Margaret Sullivan had moved to town and rented a small house where she could live and also hold classes for the local children. At first, only 5 children came to her school, but word spread quickly about the quality of education Margaret provided. By the end of the first year, she had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Margaret discovered that she loved teaching even more than she had expected. She enjoyed helping children learn to read and write, but she also loved seeing their faces light up when they understood a new concept or mastered a difficult skill. Some of the older students were learning arithmetic and basic geography, and Margaret was already planning to expand her curriculum. The parents in Millfield were so pleased with Margaret's school that they helped her build a proper schoolhouse. The men donated lumber and labor, while the women organized fundraising events to buy books and supplies. Margaret felt proud to be contributing something valuable to the community, and she enjoyed her independence as a single woman with her own profession. Elizabeth Sullivan had also thrived in her new life in Millfield. She had opened a small dress shop in a building next to the general store, and women from all over the county came to buy her beautiful clothes. Elizabeth had a natural talent for understanding what styles would flatter different body types, and she could create elegant dresses even for women who had never owned anything fancy before. Elizabeth's business grew so successful that she hired 2 other young women to help her with the sewing. She was able to support herself comfortably, and she even saved money to send back to help William with his travels. Elizabeth had also become friends with several other unmarried women in the area, and she enjoyed her social life and her independence. Sometimes, Elizabeth still felt a little sad when she watched James and Catherine together, but the sadness was mixed with genuine happiness for her sister. Elizabeth had learned that unrequited love did not have to ruin her life, and she was open to the possibility that someday she might meet someone who would return her feelings. William Morrison had left Millfield the previous fall to explore business opportunities in Colorado and California. He sent letters regularly, telling his family about the mining towns he visited and the interesting people he met. William had started a small business buying and selling goods between different towns, and he was making good money while satisfying his desire to see new places. In his letters, William wrote that he was learning a lot about different types of businesses and that he planned to return to Nebraska someday with new ideas for expanding the ranch's operations. He also wrote that he had met several young women during his travels and that he was enjoying getting to know different types of people before deciding what kind of wife would make him happy. Thomas Morrison had found his own path to happiness as well. He continued to send money to Anna and her son, and he visited them regularly to make sure they were well cared for. During one of his visits, Thomas learned that Anna's abusive husband had died in a mining accident, leaving Anna free to remarry if she chose to. Thomas and Anna had long conversations about their past relationship and their feelings for each other. They both acknowledged that they had made mistakes, but they also realized that their feelings for each other had never completely disappeared. After months of careful consideration, Thomas asked Anna to marry him, and she accepted. Anna and her son moved to Millfield Ranch, where they were welcomed by the extended Morrison-Sullivan family. Anna was a quiet, hard-working woman who fit in well with the busy household, and her son quickly became like a little brother to baby Patrick. Thomas finally had the family he had always wanted, and Anna had the security and respectability she had never been able to achieve before. By the 2nd anniversary of the Sullivan sisters' arrival in Nebraska, Millfield Ranch had become the center of a thriving extended family. The main house buzzed with activity as James and Catherine managed the ranch business, Samuel and Mary raised their growing son, and Thomas and Anna prepared for the arrival of their own baby. The ranch had expanded significantly under James and Catherine's management. They had bought more land and increased their cattle herd, and they were planning to build additional houses on the property for the growing family. Catherine had also started a small business, selling eggs and butter to people in town, adding to the family's income. Margaret's school had grown so successful that the town was planning to build an even larger schoolhouse and hire an assistant teacher. Margaret had also started offering evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading and writing skills. She felt deeply satisfied with the contribution she was making to her community. Elizabeth's dress shop had become famous throughout the region, and women traveled from far away to commission special dresses for weddings and other important occasions. Elizabeth had also begun designing and making quilts, which sold as quickly as she could make them. She had even received orders from women in Denver and Kansas City. William returned to Millfield for Christmas that year, bringing stories of his adventures and several potential business partners who were interested in investing in Nebraska cattle ranching. William had matured during his travels, and he announced that he was ready to settle down and find a wife. He had also saved enough money to buy his own piece of land adjacent to the family ranch. During the Christmas celebration, the entire extended family gathered around the large table in the main house. James and Catherine sat with their newborn daughter, while Samuel bounced 1-year-old Patrick on his knee and Mary held their second baby, a girl named Catherine after her aunt. Thomas and Anna were there with Anna's son and their own baby boy. Margaret and Elizabeth had been invited to join the family for Christmas dinner, and they brought gifts they had made for all the children. The house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the sounds of happy children playing. As they sat around the table after dinner, James raised his glass in a toast. 2 years ago, we were 4 lonely bachelors who placed advertisements in Eastern newspapers hoping to find wives. We never could have imagined that those advertisements would bring us such a wonderful, complicated, amazing family. Margaret raised her own glass. And 2 years ago, we were 4 desperate sisters who thought we had to choose between poverty and separation. We never imagined that our deception would lead us to such honest, caring people who would accept us for who we really are. Catherine looked around the table at all the faces she had grown to love. I think we have proven that families are not just made by blood or by law. Families are made by choice, by commitment, and by love. Samuel smiled as he looked at his wife and children. We have also proven that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the best destinations. Elizabeth felt a moment of wistfulness as she watched all the happy couples and families around her.